the SCOR Foundation for Science has invited Gilles Andreani to tell us his views on the geopolitical and geostrategic threats and the risk of deglobalization. Gilles Andreani is a worldwide known expert on strategic issues and more especially on European and transatlantic security issues. A graduate from the Paris Institute of Political Studies and from the ENA, the French National School of Administration, he is currently magistrate at the Cour of Auditors, the Cour des Comptes in France, where he was until recently president of chamber, and where he has just submitted a report on public risk management. After having held important responsibilities at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he led the CAP, the Analysis and Forecast Center of his minister, Gilles Andreani was personal advisor to several governments on these issues, including Dominique Villepin, when he was Prime Minister. He was also research director at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. It currently teaches international relations and state history at the Panthéon-Assas University, as well as at the Institut d'études politiques, Institute of Political Studies of Paris. In his presentation, Gilles Andreani will question recent developments in the international system, as well as the most likely crisis scenarios. Before leaving the floor to Gilles Andreani, I'd remind you that the webinar will imperatively end up at 4:30 p.m. and that the questions will be asked after the presentation, except in case of material misunderstanding, of course. Gilles, thank you so much for having agreed to undertake this exercise. You have now the floor for how long you want before I pass the floor to the listeners.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Do you hear me correctly? Is that okay? Thank you for the kind invitation. It's an honor for me to address this audience on an issue they tend to know better than I, that is risk and risk management. I'm going to speak about the geopolitical risk today, if you will, and to indicate at the outset how I feel about this based on my professional experience. I think it can be argued that from a strategic risk viewpoint, things are certainly much worse than they were 30 years ago, but possibly better than they were 60 years ago. So it's a mixed bag. But having said that, I think we have witnessed since the early 1990s, since the end of the Cold War, structural problems within the international system which make it harder to manage and contain crisis. And that will be my first point, first series of observations about four major weaknesses in the international system, growing weaknesses, which set us, I think, far apart and in a distinctly worse situation than where we were in the early 1990s. That will be my first part. And then based on that, I'll try to illustrate this opinion, if you will, by pointing at a few flashpoints, a few places, a few risk scenarios, if you will, where the situation could possibly get out of hands for the worse, before concluding of a few thoughts in conclusion. Now, let me start with the international system today. I tend to believe that there are two series of evolutions in a given situation. You have eruptions, crises flaring out, and that's distinctly difficult to prognose. But where you have the underlying structure of the system and the cracks within the system, and these are really they are both very important and easier to talk about, easier to diagnose. And that's what I'm going to do now, if I can, offering 4 series of weaknesses in the international system. First one is multipolarity, which has transformed the world system into a series of competing alignments. I think a return of great power and medium power rivalry, if you will. A second weakness is the weakness of the international institutions themselves. The third weakness is how should I put it? Sort of underlying challenge to globalization. Globalization less accepted, more criticized, and occasionally put into question. And last but not least, the international system is being weakened, I would say, by the atmospherics, by certain political attitudes which transcend the frontier between international affairs and domestic affairs, and which show, if you will, a distinct lack of patience from public opinions, from governments, an international system which has hardened as far as attitudes and as atmospherics are concerned. So let me start with multipolarity. Multipolarity, it can be assumed that it is having a number of actors sharing influence in the international system. Maybe it's a good thing. It's a sign of ownership. People feel part of the system. They exert influence. They balance each other, and as a result, the theory of international politics is generally favorable to multipolarity. But the multipolarity we are witnessing today is of another sort, if you will. It's not the European concert of the 19th century, a relatively harmonious system. It is a system where people are losing ground, others are gaining ground, and you see new alignments forming, which are not as strict and as structured as the alignments of the Cold War, but nonetheless, they reflect, if you will, growing fragmentations within the system. So let's talk about these poles, these competing poles, and how they, what sort of alignments they form, and what sort of competition they help constitute within the system. A first obvious rift within the system is that which opposes Russia and the West. It was dormant, it was silent, it has erupted with the Ukraine war. It's not going to go away anytime soon. Those who say that it's time to negotiate, a negotiation is in order, things can be calmed down on Ukraine, I think overlook the deep significance for Russia of this conflict, the quasi-existential dimension of the conflict for Russia, and for that matter Ukraine, and the enormity of the stakes on the Western side. So my own view is that this rift is going to last. And of course, the Russians accuse the West of waging a proxy war on them through Ukraine. It doesn't matter very much whether it's true or not. The important thing is that the Russians believe it, and in some ways, Putin, has convinced that he has been attacked and challenged as a great power by the West, and that is going to stay with us for some time. And since the conflict is probably going to last, I think this particular rift is going to be with us, and it's probably the most acute, and if I may say so, the most eruptive rift within the international system. The second one, more important in the long term, and considerably so, is the divide between the US and China. I just suggest that you read the national security strategies published under Obama and under President Biden. 6 years distance, and you see the tune totally changed when the United States speak of the rise of China. Under Obama, China was considered as a rival, an emerging power, both a partner and a competitor. That the tune has been totally changed under Biden, and the fall 2022 national security strategy of the United States states for the United States an overarching strategic goal, which is to not to be overtaken by China as the leading power in the world. And on the Chinese side, the same hardening is seen. So you have here a strategic divide, which is going to structure the international system for years to come. The thing is that beyond these two major alignments, you have other players than the ones I mentioned, which are sort of brought into the competition. The United States are trying to energize their alliances in Asia and redirect them to contain China. And that you look at the so-called Quad meetings, which the United States entertain with India and Japan and other powers wary about the rise of China. On the other hand, China is now not exactly joining forces with Russia, but displaying a degree of solidarity with Russia, which basically has nothing to do with, their shared fundamental interests, the shared fundamental interests of the two countries, but a lot to do with the need to align, the tactical need to align forces against the United States. And both countries are trying to enlist, if I may say so, countries, medium powers, out of, I should say, opportunistic interest, or out of ideological solidarity. A lot of countries which share the anti-imperialist or anti-colonialist views, and both Russia and China are trying to engage these countries, the so-called global South, into resisting, if I may say so, the West and the United States. That doesn't make these countries the structural allies of either Russia or China, but that makes it harder for the West to if you will, gather the international community and regroup forces when it comes to challenging destabilizing actions of either Russia or China. And when it comes to the medium powers, you see people, the so-called BRICS, which are not exactly aligned. They see differently on a number of issues, but they are certainly more individualistic and more eager to defend their interests than they have ever been. And all in all, these diverse alignments do not bring us back to the Cold War era, but nor does it bring us back to a harmonious multipolar world of the type of, if you will, the concert of Europe in the 19th century. It's fragmented, competitive, and I should say largely adversarial environment where key alignments are, if you will, entrenching countries and groups of countries, not exactly the ones against the others, but certainly in a configuration which prevents them from cooperating fully on a number of issues. So that's for multipolarity. Second point, international institutions which are weak and which are being challenged. After the fall of the Soviet Union, after the Cold War, you had a sort of golden era of international institutions. These institutions had been designed after the Second World War, and for the first time they were sort of liberated from the, if you will, the paralysis which the East-West divide had constituted for them. And you could see the UN Security Council functioning on a number of instances. You could transform the GATT into the WTO, which was a project of the immediate after Second World War era, and as of 1995, effectively structure the trade relations in a very effective way. You saw also another post-Second World War institution, the European Union, grow in membership, grow in competences, and its budget increase, and its standing in the world increase as well. So you had a number of, I would say, a golden era for international institutions. That has come to an end for a variety of reasons, which do not affect the same the institutions in the same way, and I won't dwell very long into that. But as far as the UN Security Council and the UN are concerned, the return of divide between the major powers created a paralysis which, you can argue started after the Kosovo crisis in the late 1990s. Anyway, it's still with us. Very hard to make consensus these days within the Security Council. WTO is being challenged by a number of actors, in particular the United States, for a number of reasons, all of which are not being invalid, actually. The momentum of regional integration and European integration has stalled in its much less dynamic today. And there are more fundamental criticisms being addressed to the system, especially when its economic and financial institutions are concerned. In today's world, given the distribution of wealth, does it make any sense that the head of the IMF should always be a West European and the head of the World Bank an American? Does it make any sense? And also the ability of these financial institutions to order the financial international exchanges has receded. And if you look at the main challenge, the main financial and economic challenge which faces these institutions, let's say to answer the global warming and climate change issues, they are nowhere near the financial ability and the financial surface which would be needed to do that. So, and I think the sense that the international institutions do not reflect today's share of power and wealth is acutely resented in, let's say, in those countries I mentioned earlier, the BRICS, the Global South. There has been one interesting institution created to compensate that phenomenon, that's the G20. And it can be called a success, but also it says something of the. It's an informal gathering. It's not an international institution proper, and it speaks to the limits of the legitimacy and effectiveness of the international institutions, and it cannot compensate really for the weaknesses of the formal institutions. The G20 in particular, which should normally be the new concert of nations, and which would be more representative of the distribution of wealth and power, for instance, doesn't really bring China on board. China has not been to a G20 representative G20 summit for more than 3 years now. They are reluctant to invest in that organization, and it remains a vulnerable structure. So that's as far as international institutions are concerned. The third feature of the system today, which of course you are all well aware of, which is worth mentioning, is that globalization is being challenged. It's being challenged ideologically and politically. I mean, not one major nation is going to sort of wake up in the morning and say, I want to put an end to globalization. That would make no sense, of course. But the notion that globalization, by and large, was a positive-sum game is being challenged, and I think is being replaced in a number of key countries by a political discourse which says that it's not a positive-sum game, it's a zero-sum game. That what you gain through globalization, others will have to lose, or what others gain through trade and other exchanges, your own country is losing. And that turn is particularly apparent in the United States, I think, but it's also perceptible in a number of European countries. On the side of the more moderate challengers of globalization, there is this idea that you can, in a way, pick and choose, that there are features of globalization you want to consolidate, and others where you want to restrict trade or restrict flows of capital or foreign investment for a variety of specific reasons. And these are all good reasons: national security, particularly strategic chains of production, the key features, the key components of the decarbonated economy, for instance. You want to get a hold on that if you are a government today. The problem is that globalization is a dynamic. If you interrupt it, even with qualifications like the Americans are doing vis-à-vis China, saying, oh, we want to insulate a very small number of key sectors of our economy. For the rest, we are very happy with globalization. It's a very fragile proposition. The so-called small yard, hard fences policy of the United States, in fact, has had much broader implications than these narrow strategic sectors. You see foreign direct investment on both sides, Chinese and American, declining steeply. And the problem is that once you interrupt a dynamic, you are not so sure when where you stop. And I think we have, motivated by very plausible and sometimes very convincing arguments, reshoring of key strategic industries, what have you, you have a risk that globalization is going to be perceived by and large less as a blessing and more as a constraint, and I think that's a very important change if you compare the current situation with what it was at the outset of the 1990s. You have a very distinct change here. Now, fourth and last point, weakness, and not the least of the international system, that the atmospherics, the weather is not good out there, if I may put it that way. for an international system to function, you have to have a certain degree of homogeneity of convictions, certain shared values, shared commitments to the system. You have to display, states have to display certain loyalty to the system. They must feel bound by their obligations. They must use diplomacy that is a mixture of restraint in the expression of differences and a will to narrow them if you can. That's how an international system functions. And these necessary features of atmospherical features, attitudes, which allow the international system to function, have considerably receded in the last few years. You look at the tonality of speeches, how world leaders of the most important countries how they speak to them, of their partners and to their partners. Clearly, the same degree of shared values and interest in the functioning of the system is not there anymore. And this is a matter for concern. In the early 90s, you had all sorts of people who disagreed with the system, with the dominance of the West, and especially of the United States. But they were isolated, in a way. It was a juxtaposition of dissenting views. Now these dissenting views are coalescing. They are coalescing in something which is, I would say, an expression of distrust, of open distrust vis-à-vis democracy, vis-à-vis liberal democracy, and saying, you know, both Xi Jinping, Erdogan, Putin, they have something to say about liberal democracy, which is, it's not the only type of democracy. We have a type of functioning here which is different, it's rooted in our traditions, it's more respectful of history, of our civilization, of family values, it's based on authority rather than on anarchy. And you have a sort of consensus building among a number of countries that Western democracy is only one model of democracy, and many others are just equal, just as good. And the system today reflects too much the preferences of the West, with no basis in reason or justice. I think that this coalition of oppositions is doing a lot of harm to the system. The second feature of the international system, which reinforces these tendencies, is well, what you call populism, if you want. But let's say the democracies around the world are more susceptible to discourses which, in the name of the people, in the name of the direct expression of the grievances of the people, contain an element of diffidence vis-à-vis the outside world, of violence, of verbal violence, which inevitably transpires within the international system. In a democratic world, or in a world where people allege that they are democratic, which is different, what you say within has consequences in the relations among states, and I think you see a sort of among these people who are openly distrustful of Western democracy. You see an international league of populists, if you will, which are not inhibited in overtly displaying distrust and contempt for other countries, and that contributes to the negative atmospherics, which I think characterizes the system today. A certain decline of civility, and also of the sense of responsibility among states. So I think that's the four distinct features of the international system today, which makes it harder to manage crisis. And of course, linked to these phenomena, just like for the sake of argument, and then we can discuss, I would like to outline just 4 or 5 scenarios from the worst, if I may put it that way, to perhaps the least worst or the most distant, but 5 scenarios which honestly would have been, I think, very difficult to present as plausible, let's say 25 years ago. And now, they are openly discussed, and they may be part of our future. Now, 5 scenarios, very quickly. The first, and by far the worst, for a variety of reasons, would be the scenario of an open conflict between the United States and China over a major strategic issue, control of the South China Sea, but most plausibly Taiwan. It's very worrisome that, if you will, this scenario is not only is being discussed by pundits, academics, press, but even by the leaders of these two countries themselves. If you look at the restraint with which both China and the United States used to speak about the Taiwan problem, just to give you an example, like 20 years ago, the US would say that they were against faits accomplis, unilateral moves around the China issue, meaning they were against, of course, military initiatives by China, or the threat of military action by China, but equally against a move to independence by Taiwan. It was a very respectful and prudent way of talking about the issue. Today, the President of the United States says in so many words that if China attacks Taiwan, the United States will defend China, whereas the usual diplomatic language of the China issue was much more cautious 20 years ago. And having said that, the key strategic objective of the United States is not to be outpaced by China, to remain the leading power. I think the way of speaking about the issue doesn't make the scenario likely, if you will, but slightly more plausible. And the same, of course, can be said on the Chinese side, with a discourse there again, which essentially is a discourse of threat of military action, and one which envisages timelines and a degree, I think, of impatience about the issue, which is clearly an existential issue for the Chinese leadership, which we really should be worried about. Now, I think in the deepest of their minds, neither the US nor the Chinese leaders have the slightest desire to precipitate this scenario. But the problem is, once you've gotten outspoken on a given issue, and when words are out, backing off is more difficult. And I think that's where you are. So it's not a very plausible, very likely scenario, but it's one which has marginally gained in probability. Second scenario, it's an escalation in and around Ukraine. Now, I see people skeptical about the possibility of either a geographical or a strategic qualitative extension of the conflict, in so many words, Russia escalating to nuclear weapons. To be honest, I think the only situation in which you could see such a scenario materialize would be one of abject failure for Russia. Today, it's not the most likely scenario because the possibility of a humiliating retreat for Russia seems distinctly less plausible today than it was, let's say, a year ago or 6 months ago. But it could come back, and out of despair, threatened with the loss of Crimea, which is clearly a defining subject for the Russian leadership and for Vladimir Putin. Who knows what they would do? Of course, an accident is always possible. I think Putin has been insisting that this is not a war between Ukraine, which, by the way, doesn't exist in his eyes as a country, but and Russia. But the true nature of the conflict was one between the West and Russia. Maybe he will want to make his point at some juncture, and you know, if an F-16 operating in Ukraine took refuge in Poland, which, you know, and was shot down over Polish territory. Well, that's not a non. It's a likely. It may happen. It's not an implausible scenario that you have a geographical of the conflict, geographical extension of the conflict as a result. So that's my second scenario. Let's add that there are avenues for Russia and also for Ukraine, for that matter, of other indirect way of expanding the conflict through subversion on other theaters, through cyber warfare, through covert action. So, you know, as long as this horrible conflict is going to last, the risk of it getting out of hand or being less controlled will be there. The third theater, of course, is the Middle East, and you know, as we speak, the crisis is there. It's materialized in a horrific way with the abominable attacks of the October the 7th and response by Israel, which by all standards you can call disproportionate. I mean, which is inflicting disproportionate harm on the civilian population of Gaza, and to some degree of the West Bank as well. And of course, this challenges the view that you could sideline the Palestinian problem and go for a new Middle East where Israel would find a place through the Abraham Accords and even some measure of coexistence between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two arch rivals of the region, would make for a more peaceful and more prosperous Middle East. I think this view is now being challenged. It doesn't mean that the conflict is going to expand. I think that's the last thing the Iranians in particular will want. They are cautious. They have proven cautious, but there are degrees to which one's leadership caution is not does not suffice. It's not necessarily enough. What if, out of despair, the good number of the Palestinians of Gaza are pushed out of Gaza and forced into Egypt and spread, you know, disorder, meaning a national humiliation for Egypt and so on and so forth. Who knows? So I think the possibilities that the conflict festers. The Israeli military are speaking about, let's say, another 9 months of operations, perhaps not on the same scale, but a long-term campaign in Gaza. Will the stability in the Middle East resist such a campaign and endure while these events unfold? I'm simply not sure. Now, fourth scenario, people, of course, have always a short memory. We all have. If you look at any defense-wide book of any important country, let's say in the early 2002, 3, 4, 5, the main threat was global terrorism. Systemic rivalries among states had receded. The problem of the future were only a handful of rogue states and global terrorism. And now global terrorism is by and large forgotten, even if October 7 events were terrorist acts of a horrific nature. But of course, these are localized and nationalistic acts of terrorism rather than the sort of global terrorism we saw at work on 9/11. Be that as it may, there are ingredients in our societies, in the fabric of the international system for a return of some cataclysmic act of terrorism, which I think I mention here only to revisit some of the post-9/11 scenarios. These post-9/11 scenarios envisioned, for instance, the disruption of key structures of the international system of exchange out of particularly efficient acts of terrorism, be it cyber warfare or bioterrorism. That has been forgotten. We don't speak about these things anymore, but that can come back. And I wouldn't exclude a scenario under which some of the key infrastructures of globalization will be it the air transport or some very important features of the global health system were challenged by a terrorist attack. Why not? I mean, we have to continue to think about that. The last scenario would be out of a combination of war, human suffering, exceptional national circumstances, natural circumstances, a humanitarian catastrophe of such proportions as it became suddenly unmanageable, if you will. An outflow of global outflow of refugees from Africa to Europe, which became totally unmanageable. It's conceivable. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but it's conceivable. Or such an inflow being directed or used by countries who happen to have a problem with their neighbors, so as to destabilize these neighbors. I mean, that's a scenario we can perfectly envisage. So that also is a distinct, I think, is a distinct possibility. I leave you with these different scenarios. They are not very original, but I think they, in light of the weaknesses and the structural faults within the international system, they are closer than they were perhaps a decade or certainly 20 years ago. Let me conclude by three remarks. And the three remarks are for you who are professionals of risk management. Is that geostrategic risk scenarios are never straightforward, and they are never fully in control of those who ultimately decide on them. Especially in times where the distribution of power changes, there are two essential ingredients to bad this international decisions. That's apprehensions and miscalculations. Apprehension that you are going to have to be outpaced by a rival. Apprehension that, okay, you are going to have a conflict with this country, but that's inevitable. And perhaps it's best to have it now than to have it 10 years later when you are going to be in a weaker position. So apprehension, fear is an essential determinant of international relations, and especially, once again, in times of power is being redistributed and countries are uncertain about their place in the system. And that's exactly where we are. miscalculation. I mean, an act of bluff. It's time to impress the Americans on Taiwan and show them that we can do X and Y, and you know, that gets out of hand. It has been miscalculated. That happens all the time. One of the biggest miscalculations in history has been the Cuban Missile Crisis. The failure to appreciate that the Americans would not tolerate the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba. That can happen again. So that's anticipation and miscalculation. Second features, they have a relationship with those I just mentioned. It's the mixture of fear and excessive confidence, which often characterizes countries on the rise. Some people have compared China of Xi Jinping with Wilhelmine Germany, the Germany of the years 1900. Country on the rise, but still extraordinarily apprehensive of its situation in the world, which essentially it was much better than it imagined. Germany in 1900 had the future for it. It was the first industrial power of Europe. It had hardly been overtaken by the United States on the world stage as far as industry was concerned. It was the first research country in Europe and the best universities in the world. It had impressive armed forces and essentially was not threatened. Nonetheless, it perceived of its situation as a precarious situation. Wilhelm II would say, I want my place in the sun, under the sun, where Germany wants its place under the sun. And it's this mixture of overconfidence and apprehension is an extremely dangerous one. And I wouldn't be surprised if one could look deep into the psyche of the Chinese leadership of Xi Jinping, you would find these two sentiments mixed, and the combination of these two sentiments is very dangerous. And last remark, like in the Hound of the Baskervilles, the dog which doesn't bark. There are silent crises. There are structures within the international system or situations which decay. They decay, and when you realize they have decayed to a degree where they're not repairable, it's too late. One good example is the Palestinian-Israeli question. To my mind, it's a problem without a solution. And of course, we saw the 7th of October, but it's not going to bring us closer to a solution. And why is it? It's been, left to fester for decades without a serious interest of the outside powers or the dominant power in the region, which is Israel, who should have known better. And from time to time, problems fester and structures decay. It's too late when you realize they have decayed. One which is particularly worrisome for me as a European is the European Union. By and large, you look at the European Union, it's a remarkable success story. It pulls its weight in many respects in the world. It's a rich area of the world. It's the first, second you can discuss, but it's a leading trade power. But on the other hand, and I should add something, it has resisted remarkably to the temptation of backing off from Ukraine. The degree of solidarity of Western Europe towards Ukraine is simply remarkable. But these things come and go. It could paralysis in internal decision making, divisions, lack of ambition. Could get the European Union to stall and perhaps to decay silently. So there are silent crises which people get aware of only too late. That's the last. It's a common, very common sense thought. It's not very original, but I'd like to leave you with that. And thank you very much for your patience.